Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle a topic that's both fascinating and legally complex: the protection of the seal of confession, specifically in Spanish law.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. And to guide us through this, we'll be looking at a 2021 paper by Rafael Palomino, the title, Legal Protection of the Seal of Confession in Spanish Law.
Straight to the point. I like it.
Gets right into the heart of the matter.
Well, Spain has that unique blend, strong Catholic roots, but also a modern secular legal system. This paper really digs into how those two forces interact.
It's almost like a legal tug-of-war, isn't it?
Exactly. On one side, you have those deeply held religious beliefs about the sanctity of confession, and on the other, you have the needs of the legal system. Getting all the facts, especially when serious crimes are involved.
And that clash becomes even more real when you think about some actual cases, like that one in Italy in 1993.
The priest who supposedly heard a confession connected to a mafia judge's murder.
That's the one. I mean, what happens in a situation like that? Or that case in Oregon back in 96, where a recording of a confession to a priest almost ended up being used as evidence in a murder trial.
Those examples really highlight the complexities, don't they?
Absolutely. So before we get lost in the weeds, let's define our terms. What exactly are we talking about when we say religious communications privilege? Palomino uses that term a lot.
It's basically a legal protection that shields the confidentiality of conversations between people and their religious advisors.
Okay, so kind of like the confidentiality you have with your doctor or your lawyer.
Similar, yeah, but the foundation is different. It's rooted in that concept of religious freedom.
So it's not just about privacy then. It's about protecting the right to freely practice your religion.
Exactly. Now, within that broader idea of religious communications privilege, you find the seal of confession. And that's where things get particularly interesting.
Well, the history alone is fascinating. The paper traces this all the way back to Pope Leo the Great in the 5th century. We're talking about a principle that's been around for over 1,500 years.
It's a cornerstone of the Catholic faith. And breaking that seal always been a huge no-no in canon law. Serious penalties, including excommunication.
Wow. So this isn't something they take lightly.
Not at all. The Church has repeatedly emphasized how absolute this confidentiality is.
Even in modern times.
Yes. The 1983 Code of Canon Law, and even more recently, updates in 2021, they all reiterate that the seal is untouchable.
So even with all the new canonical laws about things like the sexual abuse of minors, the seal of confession remains unbreakable.
Absolutely.
That raises a big question for me. What is it about the seal of confession that makes it so different from other types of confidentiality?
Good question. Like, a doctor can break confidentiality in certain situations, right? If a patient's a danger to themselves or someone else, why doesn't that seem to apply to the seal of confession?
Right. It seems like there's a different standard.
Well, Palomino brings up this point. Thomas Aquinas, that famous theologian, argued that the seal isn't just some rule, it's woven into the very essence of the sacrament of confession itself.
Part of its divine nature, so to speak.
Exactly. And from that perspective, not even the person making the confession, the penitent, can release the priest from that obligation. It's not negotiable.
So you can't just wave it away.
Yep.
And that's where the big clash with the legal system comes in, right?
Sure.
I mean, the law often demands that people reveal information, especially if it's crucial to a criminal case.
It creates this fascinating dilemma, right? You have the pursuit of justice, which depends on uncovering the truth. But then you have this fundamental right to religious freedom, and that includes protecting the absolute secrecy of religious confessions.
So how does Spanish law handle that tension? They're operating in a mostly secular society. How do they even begin to address that clash?
Well, they approach it from two main angles: specific agreements with religious groups and general legal principles that are already part of their system.
Okay, I'm curious. Let's break those down. What are these agreements like? How do they protect these confidential religious communications?
A big one is the agreement between Spain and the Holy Druck. See, back in 1976. And get this, it's not just about confession. It protects all information obtained through ministry.
Whoa, that's a broad umbrella.
It is. So anything a priest learns during their ministry is protected.
Interesting. What about other religious groups? Are there similar agreements in place?
Yes, there are. In 1992, Spain signed agreements with other groups. Evangelicals, Jewish communities, Islamic communities, they all have clauses protecting religious communications.
So Spain's making a real effort to be inclusive and respect religious freedom across different faiths.
It seems that way. But here's the catch. When you look closely at the wording in these agreements, some interesting differences pop up.
Oh, I'm sure those nuances matter. What kind of differences?
Well, for example, the agreement with the Islamic Commission of Spain, it specifically connects the religious communications privilege to professional secrecy.
Okay, how does that change things? How is that different from the agreement with the Holy See?
It suggests a different way of thinking about the protection. It's less about the communication itself being sacred, like in the Catholic view, and more about the privacy of the individual within a professional relationship.
So the protection is there because of the relationship, like between an imam and someone in their community. Sort of like the confidentiality between a doctor and a patient.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it could make a big difference legally.
This is fascinating, but I'm dying to know how this actually plays out in real life. How do these protections for religious communications function in Spanish courts?
Now, that's where it gets real. Let's move on to the next part of our deep dive to explore that. So let's dive into how these principles actually play out in Spanish courts. You know, Spanish law has these procedures that allow ministers of religion to be excused from testifying based on their religious duties.
That makes sense, right? It's like acknowledging that there could be these tricky situations where religious beliefs and legal obligations clash. But I'm guessing it's not as straightforward as just showing up and saying, nope, I'm a priest, I can't testify.
You're right, it's not a blanket exemption. Both Spanish civil and criminal law have these procedures in place. So a minister of religion can request to be excused from testifying, but it's ultimately up to the court to decide whether or not to grant that exemption.
So it's not a guaranteed right. It's more like a recognized possibility for conflict that the court has to sort out on a case-by-case basis. What kinds of things do courts weigh when making these decisions?
It probably depends on the specifics of each case, right? Like what kind of information are they looking for and how important is it to the case?
And I'd imagine the judge's own understanding of the religious principles involved probably plays a role.
Definitely. Like how familiar is the judge with the nuances of different religious traditions? How much weight do they give to the importance of protecting religious communications? Those factors could influence the outcome.
Makes you wonder if there have been any big cases in Spain that have really grappled with this, like cases where religious ministers were actually called to testify.
Actually, there is. Palomino brings up this really interesting case in his paper. It went all the way to the Spanish Supreme Court in 1990. It involved a priest who was called to testify in a case about stolen jewels. It's a good illustration of how they try to balance these competing interests in practice.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the legal drama. What happened?
So picture this. A man confesses to stealing some jewels during confession. Later on, he arranges for those stolen jewels to be delivered to the priest.
Hold on. That's a twist. So now the priest is holding the actual evidence.
Exactly. And when the case goes to court, the guy who stole the jewels, he's thinking, okay, maybe I can get a lighter sentence if I show how sorry I am. So he asks for the priest to be called as a witness, probably figure that having the priest confirm he returned the jewels would make him look good.
Smart legal strategy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But would the priest actually break the seal of confession to do that?
Nope. The priest stuck to his religious obligations, the sanctity of the seal, and refused to appear in court.
So now the court's in a bind.
Mm.
Do they force the priest to testify, even if it violates his religious freedom? Or do they let him stay silent and potentially let the thief off easy? What do?
The Spanish Supreme Court sided with the priest, reaffirmed how strong that religious communications privilege is under Spanish law.
Wow. So they upheld the seal of confession, even in a case involving stolen goods and a potential criminal conviction.
Yep. They ruled that to make a priest testify about something he learned during confession, you'd need the explicit permission of the person who confessed.
So it wasn't enough that the thief wanted the priest to talk. The person who actually made the confession had to agree to waive the confidentiality.
Precisely. And in this case, that permission wasn't given. The court also made this important point. Just because you confess to a crime during confession, that doesn't automatically mean you get a lighter sentence.
That's an important distinction. Repenting to a priest doesn't wipe away your responsibility to the law.
Exactly. Spanish law upholds this idea that you're accountable for your actions in the secular world, even if you've sought forgiveness within your religion.
This case is a perfect example of how tricky it can be for courts to balance religious freedom with the need for justice. It's not always a clear-cut situation.
Yeah, these are complicated issues that need a nuanced approach.
So it sounds like Spanish law offers pretty strong protection for the seal of confession, at least within the Catholic Church. But we talked earlier about how Spain has many different faiths. are those protections equally strong for other religious communities?
That's a really important question, and it gets to the heart of some of the challenges of protecting religious freedom for everyone in a society that's becoming more and more religiously diverse.
I'm definitely curious to hear more about that.
Mhm.
What are some of the differences or challenges that other religious groups face when it comes to protecting the confidentiality of their communications?
Well, a key difference is the legal basis for these protections. Remember how we discussed those specific agreements between Spain and the Holy See, the ones that protect the seal of confession for Catholic priests?
Yeah, those agreements are really rooted in tradition and canon law, right?
Exactly. There's this long history and legal precedent backing them up. But for other religious communities, those protections might come from more general legal principles, like the right to freedom of religion or the right to privacy.
So it's not as explicitly spelled out in the law as it is for the Catholic Church.
Right, and that can sometimes create uncertainty or make them more vulnerable, because how these protections are interpreted and applied might differ depending on the case and the judge's understanding of the religious practices involved.
So even though the legal framework might be there, it's not as clear-cut or consistently applied for everyone.
Exactly. And this is where advocacy and education come in. Religious communities need to make sure legal professionals and the public understand how important it is to protect religious communications within their own traditions.
It's like a constant effort to bridge the gap between the legal system and the diverse ways people practice their faith.
Absolutely. It's all about making sure that everyone's right to religious freedom is protected, regardless of their beliefs.
This has been an incredible conversation. I feel like I'm really starting to understand the complexities of religious communications privilege and how challenging it is to navigate these rights in a diverse and constantly changing society.
It's been great exploring this with you, but there's still more to uncover. We have one last part to wrap this up.
We've really dug into some fascinating stuff, but I want to keep exploring this idea of protecting religious communications in a society with lots of different faiths. It seems like finding that balance could be really tough.
Oh, absolutely. Especially as Spain keeps becoming more diverse. I mean, how do you respect traditional religious practices while also ensuring that all those different faith communities are treated equally? That tension just gets more and more complex.
Do you have any specific examples of how that plays out in the legal world? Like, how does that tension actually manifest?
Sure, let's think about Spain's Islamic community. Remember, we talked about that agreement signed back in 1992 between Spain and the Islamic Commission of Spain.
Yeah, the one that was supposed to protect religious communications for Muslims living in Spain.
Right. But the language they use in that agreement is really interesting. Instead of saying this protection is like a fundamental right, based on how sacred religious practices are, they tie it to this concept of professional secrecy.
We talked about that a little bit before, and I remember thinking, that's a subtle difference, but it could have some pretty big implications.
Exactly. Think about it this way. For Catholic priests, the seal of confession is like this absolute, unbreakable duty. It comes from the sacrament itself, right? And it's something you can just waive, even if the person confessing wants to.
And those agreements between Spain and the Vatican really reinforce that, right? They have all that history and legal weight behind them.
Precisely. But with the Islamic Commission, it's different. They're protecting religious communications by saying it's like professional confidentiality, similar to what doctors or lawyers or therapists have.
So it's not so much about the communication itself being holy or sacred. It's more about protecting someone's privacy within that professional relationship.
You got it. And that reflects a whole different approach to how we think about religious freedom. It's relying on these secular legal ideas, not specific religious doctrines.
That makes me wonder, does framing it that way, like it's professional secrecy, does that actually change how much protection Muslim religious leaders have in Spain? Could it lead to different outcomes if those cases end up in court?
You're asking some really great questions, and to be honest, there's no easy answer. Some legal scholars argue that framing it as professional secrecy actually makes the protection weaker.
Really? Why is that? I think confidentiality between, say, a lawyer and their client is pretty strong.
It is strong, but it's not absolute. Like with professional confidentiality, there are often exceptions, especially if there's a chance of harm to someone else or if it involves criminal activity.
I see where you're going with this. So if a judge decides to treat the protection of Muslim religious communications like professional secrecy, there might be more situations where they feel like they have to force disclosure, even if it goes against the religious leader's beliefs.
Exactly. But with the seal of confession, the way Catholics understand it, there are no exceptions. It's untouchable.
So it seems like Muslim religious leaders who feel a deep obligation to protect what people tell them, they could face some real challenges.
For sure, it adds a whole other layer of complication, and it shows why we need to keep talking about these issues, keep educating people. We have to make sure the legal system really understands and respects all the different ways that religious communities practice their faith.
And it shows how important it is to be really precise when you're writing these agreements. Even small differences in the wording can have huge consequences in the real world.
You said it. It's not enough to just say, yeah, we support religious freedom. You have to make sure the laws actually protect those specific practices and beliefs that are so important to different faiths.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion. I feel like I have a much better grasp now of how tricky religious freedom can be in a diverse society like Spain.
It's been my pleasure talking about this with you. And hey, remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. There's so much more to learn about the fight for religious freedom and how we can balance individual rights with the rule of law.
Thank you so much for taking the time to guide me through this fascinating and complex topic. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring this. Have those thoughtful conversations. Be advocates for religious freedom in all its beautiful forms. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.